Network's family of shows. Available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day, we'll be getting into the nitty gritty of your fantasy basketball squad. The small forward position, one of the most versatile positions in all of fantasy basketball because of the depth of that position and the ways you can frame certain players as well. For example, you want to know how we say Luke is a point guard? You could very well put him at the small forward position if you so choose. And I feel like this indefinable nature of the position makes it a lot of fun to analyze just because all of these guys are prototypical, like I said, small forwards. But their own versatility and how they operate for their team speaks volumes to the evolution of this position and what this position really means in both real life on the basketball court and in a fantasy basketball perspective. So without further ado, let's try and tackle the complexities of the small forward position because it is one of my favorite positions to talk about. And all four of these guys, like I said, are on rebuilding squads in a sense. They're all in and around the play-in picture, but all in squads who I feel like need to understand the evolutionary nature of the game and really appreciate these players for what they are, because they are in their own right very complex players to pin down. Because when I look at the importance they mean to these teams, because like I said, they are quote unquote playing / rebuilding teams. They really are asked a lot in terms of what they mean this team, and sometimes at least the detriment of these teams, and sometimes it leads to success. And so that's what I want to say about this position, because a lot of weight are being placed on these players' shoulders, and so it's going to come down to how that affects their overall play in the landscape of the latter stage of the season as they're fighting for playoff positioning. But ultimately, I really like this position group just because of its depth as well and how much you can play around with it in terms of who to put where. Without further ado, let's talk about it. Starting off with Anthony Edwards, a guy who really had to step up this season, what with, the absence of Karl Anthony Towns off to New York and the addition of Julius Randle, because I don't necessarily think that was a partnership that a lot of people thought would work, because they are very ball-dominant guys. Julius Randle's shooting numbers have never been truly great in certain situations, and Anthony Edwards wants to be that number one option, and he has played very well. But this is a Timberwolves team, right, that got to the Western Conference Championships last year on the backs of Anthony Richardson carrying the burden. And this season it feels like, with the absence of Cat and the addition of Julius Randle, and the fact that I don't necessarily believe these sixth men options or these role players on the bench are performing at the levels they were in the postseason, I think that leads to the decline of this roster, even though I like the pieces they have. I like the depth defensively with Rudy Gobert, with the addition of someone like Julius Randle, who I still think has value there. But it's guys like Naz Reid, McDaniels, who I want to see step up and take some of the pressure off Anthony Edwards, who still has been a very impressive fantasy basketball player, 42.5 points per game in that respect, 24.8, 5.7, 3.9 stat line. But I just want to see this Wolves team alleviate the pressure on him, even though he knows he's capable of leading this team to high heights. And that's why I feel like this season has kind of been a disappointment. At least the start of the season for Minnesota has been kind of a disappointment compared to where they finished last year. But with all these players really stepping up and taking on certain roles needed for this team to succeed, like the Naz Reids and Jaden McDaniels of the world. And so, even with the additions of guys like Randall and DiVincenzo, who really, I thought, weren't necessarily great fits, but hypothetically could have balanced this team out, I'm really disappointed to see the decline of this team as a whole, and not just because of where they were last season, but because of what it means for Anthony Edwards and the challenges he might face in the latter stage of the season as he tries to make this team a viable contender again in the Western Conference. So that's kind of in the back of my mind when I think about Anthony Richardson from a fantasy perspective, as someone who to this point has been an admirable player at the small forward position, but might face a lot more pressure down the line than you might think as a fantasy player and in real life as well. Let's talk about a guy who has been absent for very long this season, missed the first 34 games of the season, finally going to come back hopefully in these next couple of weeks, Kawhi Leonard. And we talked about what he could mean as he comes back to this really revitalized LA Clippers team from where they were in the offseason when Kawhi was really disgruntled with a whole contract situation, what with everyone leaving LA, and what with just being him and Harden. And ultimately, a lot of people were spreading rumors that potentially this injury was fake, but now he's coming back to a situation that both him and Harden can work with as the leaders of this team. And we know already what value Kawhi adds in terms of his offensive prowess and the way he can space the floor, and his defensive prowess is perhaps one of the best defensive talents of his generation. So combine that with the way the Clippers are already playing in terms of what Harden has been able to do, what players like Zubac has been able to do defensively, and in terms of adding to the competitiveness of this team, I feel like Kawhi Leonard will be glad to see and enter this situation, because from where it was last year, like I said, in the offseason, I feel like there's been a narrative shift, a mindset shift, an energy shift that the Clippers can achieve something this season. And so that's why I feel like even though Kawhi Leonard has not played all this season and a lot of people are starting to lose faith in him, lose trust in him from a fantasy perspective, he still might be a high value pick in terms of when he comes back. A lot of people should be clamoring to have him in their rosters as a guy who has one of the best two-way mindsets in all of basketball. Playing for a team now that has meaning, has life, has rejuvenation to it. And I feel like Kawhi Leonard wants to play this organization at a competitive level again because he knows and sees what this team can be after all the rumblings of the offseason. So that's why even though Kawhi has not played at all this season, he comes back into a situation that really sets up very nicely for him down the stretch. And so I'm really excited to see what he can piece together in the latter stages of the season once he returns. Now let's talk about someone really intriguing right now. And I would not have thought this player would be so controversial, so contentious at this point in his career, both a fantasy and real life perspective. Let's talk about LeBron James and what he means right now to this Lakers offense, to the organization, and to fantasy owners everywhere. Because he truly is someone who provides a lot of upside at this late stage in his career. But when we look at it, it's the detriment of this team overall. This team could be a lot better, not just a playing team, but a true Western Conference contender if LeBron's usage rate was limited. I feel like Redick hasn't understood that dynamic just yet, hasn't made the business decisions yet, where you have to weigh the options you have in this team. You have to weigh the beneficial aspects of certain decisions over the player that LeBron is. And even though he's putting up insane numbers still at this age, 50.1 fantasy points per game, 23.4, 7.7, 8.9 averages, he is someone who is just so contentious because even when he's on the court, you see that this team really is forcing things. Maybe because it's who he is, and maybe it's because of who the coach is and how he wants to approach this team. But I do feel like that connection gets in the way of what this Lakers organization is becoming. It's becoming a team that can be built around a lot of exciting youth. I love what Connect is doing. I love what Reeves can be. And I love how aggressive they've been in free agency and the draft in terms of building this team. But it can't just be around LeBron right now, because LeBron is in the future of this organization. And so that's why I'm a little bit concerned, not just in real life, but in fantasy, with how it looks in the latter stages of the season. Because I do expect the Lakers to be competitive, and they can very well steal one of those play-in spots. And I still have faith that if they do, they'll be a sneaky candidate for dark horse contender status come the postseason. But I feel like LeBron can't get in the way of that sometimes. So unfortunately, this could be a statement where I'm saying to sell LeBron at a certain point this season. But for now, I just want to see the dynamic. Because what I'm seeing is that the team surrounding him is kind of forcing things when he's on the court. And that could be because of his stature. That could be because of what JJ Redick wants out of him. But until then, I feel like LeBron James might be a detriment both in real life and fantasy. But speaking of, not necessarily detriments, but his team is not necessarily one of the best teams in the West. Let's be real here. But Lauri Markkanen has always been a special player in my mind, no matter where he's moved around. He's just been one of the most versatile athletes in the NBA, who not a lot of people really respect. And I feel like, yes, he's in a situation where it's not beneficial to anyone in the Utah Jazz organization, and I think a lot of people are disheartened by the fact this rebuild is taking a lot longer over there. But Lauri Markkanen, let's be real here, for what this team is still a very nice player, both offensively and defensively. 19.6, 6.3, 1.9. Yes, lower averages than a lot of these guys, only 33 points in fantasy per game he's given you, but still a lot of value for someone on a rebuilding team. We can't necessarily forget about Lauri Markkanen just because of the fact he's on the Utah Jazz. And I feel like, whether or not he's going to be there for the long run to help with this rebuild, he is someone who I have high respect for as someone who's moved around the league a lot and still maintained a level of competitiveness and athleticism at the small forward position, and the versatility, most importantly, to help certain teams. Let me know what you think of the small forward position, because coming up next to conclude the show, our last show here with the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, is the power forward position, one of my favorite positions to talk about because of the depth and talent you can get out of it. We'll be right back to conclude the show after this short break.